Fear, the feeling deep in your gut when storm clouds brew overhead, when a light pops suddenly, taking all the light out of a room. That primal feeling that takes us back to waiting in the dark, hoping nothing will jump out.
The things that make us afraid, the monsters that lurk in the dark, have been the subject of my fascination for as long as I can remember. The roots of many modern horror genre tropes and styles can be dated back to the Gothic art of the 19th century. The shift into this world of horror was no accident, for morbidity will always be a part of human nature. But the 19th century held a very specific combination of innovation, revolution, and rebellion that brought upon the imaginings of many artists that displayed a new and fresh obsession with all things creepy. The thing about horror is that it's hard to describe but very easy to feel. To keep it simple here, let's clarify the types of horror that I'll be discussing is going to stick to monsters, creatures, darkness, and nightmares. It is important to note that I'm also only really going to be covering European artists, as there have been incredible and fantastic horror creations throughout the world that sadly we'll not be getting to here. The early 19th century brought upon the Romantic movement, a subsection of that being the Gothic movement. Romanticism was a movement that kind of coincided with the creative revolution against the very strict ideals towards logic that the Age of Enlightenment created beforehand. Strict empirical ideals that defined the Age of Enlightenment were fought against by artists who wanted to explore imagination and creativity. Further, the Gothic movement wasn't just based in painting, but as well in literature. See Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. A revival of Gothic architecture, macabre themes, and contemplative pieces focusing on death and mortality all were important at this time, creating a fresh wave of gloriously spooky art. How an era like this came to be brings us back to what most conversations of movements in the 19th century go back to: neoclassicism. If I really wanted to sell the neoclassical woman illusion, I should slouch sadly in the corner to betray my womanly weakness. The neoclassical style dominated the art world in Europe for most of the 18th century and into the early 19th century. This strict grounding in the classical past became a staple in academy teachings and was nearly essential for artists to master to become famous or well respected in the art world. The neoclassic focused on depicting the classical world with a lot of respect and dignity. This tied into a lack of representing current events that made the neoclassical a fairly conservative movement that was happy to be uncritical of the political world around it, happy to upkeep respect for authority, to display antiquity again and again, and to ensure that the Age of Enlightenment's beliefs in reason and logic were strongly upheld. It became the Academy standard to depict historical scenes of antiquity, which left very little room for landscapes, still lifes, or any other topic or subjects that artists might want to explore. But here's the thing about artists: the people who live to imagine, who live to create. Strict boundaries can only hold them for so long. Although not every movement can be directly related to a pushback against the neoclassical, it is really important to know that this wave of fresh, new art was this massive pendulum swing away from the neoclassical that was starting to feel stale in changing political, social, economic times. Further, the 19th century brought upon this exploration of new ideas that started in the Age of Enlightenment and expanded past its more distinct beliefs of logic and reason, taking the political movements that rose during this time that made us question freedom with revolutions and new wars happening, brought upon a wave of new ideas that inspired everyone to try and be more. There are countless artists that deserve a round of applause for their contributions to the world of horror, but for the sake of time, let's stick to three that I believe show, one after the other, a journey from gore to monstrosity. Let's exhume Jericho. Theodore Jericho bravely depicted the most violent parts of humanity and didn't feel any need to be pretty. The Raft of Medusa is such a tremendous piece of art history. It showed a new depiction of violence and offered a fresh sense of perspective and brought on a new era of romanticism and symbolized its artistic purpose and depth. Jericho was, simply put, a man intrigued by wrongness. Born in 1791 in France at the tail end of the French Revolution, Jericho entered a world with blood of revolution still drying on the ground. His paintings ranged from depictions of well-known disasters to portraits focusing on a person's individual low moments. Even a painting of a horse was made to depict its fright, its emotional state, rather than its neutrality. Jericho was a free spirit in many ways, fascinated by looted art, an individualist uninterested in the thoughts of the Academy, and even the thoughts of the French government itself. Jericho didn't shy away from ugly things. He created works with nauseating imagery that forced the audience to look into themselves and the horror they were willing to accept and see in other people. To make a long story very short, The Raft of Medusa is a painting inspired by the real-life events of a horrifying ship crash of colonizers on the way to Senegal that led to cannibalism, death, and shame for the French. This was a deeply unflattering light to paint the French in, an ugly truth preferred to be swept under the rug. This is exactly why Jericho loved it. He spent countless hours tracing and interviewing those who survived, studying dead bodies and the ways they rotted or looked in pieces. It would be untrue to say the ugliness of humanity was never shown in art before, but the sheer level of gore, grossness, and skin-crawling imagery that Géricault introduced is alone a massive leap from, say, the bloodlessness of The Intervention of the Sabine Women by Jacques-Louis David. Bodies are frail, socks are hanging sadly off the feet of their subjects, making them look weak and disregarded. Waves push harshly in a reddish sky. Whether or not this was an accurate representation of the scene didn't matter. Emotionality came first to create a harrowing story of characters that forced the audience to feel that tingle of goosebumps, that trickling echo of fear. This move towards representing ugliness to create something stronger than traditional beauty and pleasure is referred to as the sublime, but let's put a pin in that for now. But you might be thinking, where are the monsters? Allow me to introduce you to... Alright, that'll do it. Can I go? You can go. Thanks. Henry Fuseli was a Swiss painter born in 1741 who spent many years of his life in Britain. A tumultuous life on the run from his home country and continuous situations falling in love with women he couldn't have. That woman was his niece, but who am I to judge? The point is, all these things work together to create a man very observant of the darker parts of himself and his human psychology. Human freedom and the horror that comes with it is something that Fuseli's art often can be looked into when trying to understand, and that he created very emotive art that was meant to be intentionally provocative. The painting itself still upholds certain qualities of the neoclassical, with staged figures, women draped weakly in corners, generally neat and clean brushstrokes, and a shallowness of depth that keeps focus on the figures in the front, although he does play around with the idea of figures in the background. Alright, let's talk about the dark horse in the room. This painting is nothing like what the Academy had probably seen in a very long time. The depiction of ancient Greek monsters wasn't entirely unheard of in neoclassical art, but there was a certain expectation of beauty and order that didn't leave room for demons or monsters of the night. Although of course The Nightmare is not Fuseli's only piece by far, it is kind of this perfect example of how his personal style helped to define an era of Gothic art that beasts lived within people's imaginations as reflected on the canvas. The unconscious mind and the horrors it provides when we aren't in control ties into our deep fears of what waits not only outside but within ourselves. The pointy-eared, hairy beast hovering over the innocent woman as strange creatures lurk behind demonstrates this kind of finding comfort in a fantastical monster that is meant to represent a more real, grounded issue. Whether the dark horse represents shame that the beast is committing such a horrible sin, this incubus succubus force forcing sexuality upon this innocent woman, or whether or not it's meant to be a voyeur in this scene, doesn't really matter as much as this feeling of the unconscious coming to life that the painting produces. The individual pieces of the horse, the demon, the way in which light is used and the woman is draped all come together to create what now feels pretty familiar in an age of horror films, where shadowy beasts hovering over our comfortable spaces like beds and baths is one of the most common sources of imagery. This was an unbelievably innovative piece of the time, forcing people to self-reflect by offering a visual look into the nightmares that once only existed in the binds of one's imagination and in their sleep. This piece offers a look into a nightmare that brings people's worst beastly desires to the forefront. It makes you question whether or not the men you know are safe, whether or not what happens in their minds is as savory as what you imagine happens when they talk to you. The use of monsters was new and a really fabulous thing that allowed horror to use this kind of innate human imagination to bring more psychological sensations and emotions to life. Monsters are a comfortably foreign way to handle real and scary topics in a way that feels guarded and even safe despite the initial sense of horror. This horror is truly chilling, but it leads us to something, or more specifically someone, that takes these base pieces and turns into something truly fantastic. I have to admit, the taste of this fake blood is it's an experience. Francisco Goya is a fascinating artist that embodies political unrest and the beasts of the imagination, all to create a truly unnerving scenes of horror that went on to inspire generations of horror creators to this day. Francisco Goya was born in Spain in 1746 and is without a doubt one of the most influential painters of the 19th century. He had a fascinating and terrifying view of the world, shaped by watching wars take place and take the lives of hundreds of thousands of men. Goya, however, was in a unique position in terms of representing these themes. It can perhaps be said that rules are best broken when they're understood. Goya knew the rules. In fact, he worked as a painter for the royal family for much of his early career. Things changed, however, after the Spanish War for Independence happened, and Goya watched as the lives of hundreds were taken and the violence that ensued. Although Goya survived these battles, it can be easily seen that the scars did not heal. Violent imagery became not only commonplace in his work, but essential in its themes. It has been stated that perhaps this depiction of war in a truthful, more bloody light was Goya's ways of exorcising the demons and sins he feels like he committed. Though I wish to focus more on his later works, the sheer brutality in pieces such as The 3rd of May, which depicted the unfair nature of the French's actions against the Spanish, cannot be ignored when understanding his track into creating and painting monsters and horror. With age and a degrading mental state, Goya's art became strange and his subjects monstrous. Although some of his early work showed his signs of interest in horror, such as The Sleep of Reason from 1798, or a depiction of an insane asylum in Yard with Madmen from 1794, works dated in the 1820s show a completely new side of his artistic vision. One piece that exemplifies this to me is Saturn devouring his son, which I've recreated here, with Barbies. In my opinion, Saturn devouring his son is a fantastic example of Goya's movement into more horrific art. It is important to note that this piece, Saturn devouring his son, was not simply a painting he sold, but a mural that was in his own home for him to see every single day. It depicts Saturn, a titan, with a crazed expression as he devours the body of a son, head and limbs missing. He's covered in blood, as is his child. Some have said that this piece was perhaps made to represent the struggle with oneself losing their sense of power and agency in the world.
Others have suggested it to be Goya coming to terms with his old age, and others say it was even a representation of his relationship with his son and the way the revolution ate its young.
There's a primal sense of horror in this piece. The way the figure emerges from nothing to stare directly at you with deranged, wide eyes. The body's missing pieces, making us know that this scene is one we have stepped into, with a hungry giant devouring flesh, perhaps ready to have more. The blood also reminds us of the massive difference between the art of the neoclassical and Romantic period. Bloodlessness is a concept that still exists in action movies today. There's something uncanny about violence without blood. The refusal in this piece to wipe away the blood is what helps it feel so gritty and terrifying. This sense of gore can even be stated as what brings these three artists together, a refusal to wipe away the blood, to make an unclean image clean. Refusing to wipe away blood defines an era of horror in a time that could no longer pretend that the world was clean. Later works of Goya show witches, demons, satanic rituals, and more. These monsters feel pulled straight out of the worst depths of one's imagination, the fear of what lurks within and beyond. Goya had a fantastic quality of creating unsettling art that felt so deeply personal. Although an artist like Fuseli still felt slightly bound to certain artistic staples and traditions, with his painting style and brushstrokes not feeling all too dissimilar to neoclassical art, Goya's expression, messy brushwork, and strange shadows all felt unique and fresh. Nightmares, the deep recesses of the mind. This one motif helped to define much of the horror of the 19th century Romantic movement. In Goya's Sleep of Reason, horrible creatures associated with the darkest, most suspicious parts of humanity, like birds, bats, cats, all escape the mind in the sleep that comes when you let reason drift away. Enlightenment focused so much on science and reason that it became important to artists like Blake or Burke to go against this and delve into the imagination. Both the death of reason and the birth of the sublime help explain horror's rise in Romanticism. The sublime is important that it offers a new view of what art should be. A mix of pain and pleasure makes the feelings one feels when looking at art feel more impactful and more severe. Burke encouraged the idea that beauty is best found not in typical aesthetic pleasures, but by the deep feeling in your chest closer to terror. This, of course, could be created by a coastal landscape with far-reaching hills that you just feel yourself falling off of, or with hidden beasts that make your skin crawl, or a bloody scene forcing once avoided gore to come to the surface. Those consuming and creating art wanted more than pretty, and the sublime offered a feeling of true and utter immersion and emotion. It is important to note that although ugliness, as we may colloquially know it in concerning horror, is not connected to the sublime, ugliness in a more refined version is. Ugliness is not itself a sublime idea, but an embracing of ugliness when eliciting divine terror is. But horror especially captures the human emotion of fear, one that so effectively robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning. Terror is something innate in being alive, so capturing it is in a way capturing life. Disillusion towards reason was important to artists like William Blake, who became disheartened by the forceful statements of Enlightenment philosophers and scientists that the world was explainable. To artists with grand imaginations, the idea of anything being fully explainable was an affront to the nature of creativity. In this, representations of dreaming became essential in diving into the unconscious, where reason had no home, and exposing the beasts that live within our minds. Dreams function as a place beyond the reality we see and rationalize. Dreams were thought to be a place where enemies could live and forbidden pleasures could play out. A surrender of control brings upon dreams, meaning that reason can finally be left behind to make way for our truest intentions and thoughts. That's why dreaming reappears over and over again in horror. The depth of our mind is where unreasonable suggestions live, where beasts can come to represent our worst desires. The unconscious and the death of reason are a large part as to why pieces like The Nightmare came to be. Monsters don't exist, they don't make sense, there's no reason for them to exist. Only in our imagination can they come to be. That is why sailors tell tales of kraken sinking their ships, because it is easier to imagine a horrible monster than to accept the dangers of going on a journey. There's something comforting about the nature of beasts, that we don't have to be fully responsible for ourselves, for our worst actions, and that no reason can explain why we as humans are drawn to evil, or pain, or war. Or perhaps monsters come from somewhere deeper in the mind. Which leads us to... It ruins the magic of creativity when you realize how most things can be explained with reason. Heartbreaking to my creative heart, the Enlightenment did have a little bit of a point. Using modern psychology, we can investigate the psyche of artists who created horror to explain why those horrors existed. Fuseli and his perverted obsession with his niece is just one example for how one could use the context of sickness to inspire art. And the other two artists above also represent fascinating cases of insanity and obsession. Géricault was obsessed with the raft of the Medusa and studied hundreds of dead bodies and interviewed countless survivors, even rebuilding the raft itself. Even then, he still struggled with immense self-doubt that infected him until the day he died, that in his head he still thought he'd created a failure. The most potent example of these artists and their health impacting their art, however, is Goya. Goya's life changed in 1793 when he was bedridden for several months, often thought to be the start of a lifelong autoimmune disorder that caused psychiatric problems. Further, he was left deaf and disillusioned to the cruel actions of the French and their violence against the men he fought alongside. It is often thought that there's a necessary pain to create art, insisting that the inner emotional landscapes are best understood in turmoil. Ruthless perfectionism, pressures of the world at large towards painters, and mental illness have all been traced to many famous artists. Then again, it feels wrong to say that all horror must come from people afflicted with something terrible within themselves. Although it is easy to see something chilling in art associated with horror or extreme states of mind, and assume the artist must be some kind of cruel or broken to understand it, there is more of a chance that curiosity had more to do with it than illness. However, it is important to state how external factors can influence the styles in horror and art. A large part of the Romantic period can be understood by the time it existed in. With an array of horrors happening in real life, it only makes sense for that horror to be reflected in art. When a piece of art is made can often explain many of the reasons why it is the way it is. In terms of the Romantic period, it began in the early 19th century and continued until the rise of modernism. The current events happening in the world at the time defines much about the horror that existed in the art. Across Europe, wars, revolutions, slavery, and colonization were becoming overpowering forces of human evil that became harder and harder to ignore. For the artists above, great changes after the Age of Enlightenment created a vast new political divides that forced artists to question logic that was becoming so relevant in their lives. Géricault was a political rebel who worked to display the horrors preferred to be brushed aside by the French government. Fuseli broke boundaries to depict erotic desires considered shameful. Goya lived through the pain and strife of watching the Spanish War for Independence. The pain that was wrought in events like this inspired a shift of his art from faithful to the royals into bloody beasts. Monstrous imagery was his way of processing the horrors committed by man. A refusal to accept reason behind awful actions was what brought on the imagination so important to the Gothic style. A refusal to accept logic and reason was a big part of why imagination became such an important part of the movement towards Romanticism and the Gothic. If one cannot make sense of the violence we as humans are capable of committing, one can instead create distorted beasts of ourselves until the beast is desirable compared to the truth. Of course, Goya's story is only a tiny piece of history. However, it offers glimpses into the turmoil combined with a fresh sense of anti-Enlightenment focus on rationality that made this changing world of politics, social relations, and economic hardships feel far more fascinating and impact artists and their art. Speaking of impact, Art from the 19th century has an incredible impact today, just as much as when it was made. Mary Shelley was thought to perhaps have even been inspired by Fuseli's Nightmare, with the themes of sexual repression often reflected in its Beast, and the novel forsaking a woman, perhaps on her wedding night. In the future of film, the power of artists like Goya still is seen in horror films today. For example, Guillermo del Toro cited Saturn devouring his son when describing this scene in Pan's Labyrinth. The rise of beasts in this form and their popularity in art was unbelievably important in moving into a world of Gothic inspiration. The Gothic forced people to investigate the dark parts of their souls with that focus on logic and reason, such as what was encouraged in the Enlightenment period. After years of bloodlessness in art that often made war seem prideful and men reasonable, the Gothic offered a chance to face oneself honestly through almost a sense of fantasy. But there are lots of ways to understand oneself, to self-reflect. So, my love of horror was often because it felt like it offered a release of the worst emotions within us. The fear of the unknown, of what waits in the dark, has always fascinated me. My passion for art has never been in that depicting brave soldiers going off to war, but what lurks in the shadows of a background unexplored. Horror was created almost as a statement against reason, against logic. And isn't that the most human thing, to try and create a monstrous reason to have no reason at all? Let me explain. Say the world is ever chaotic and our imagination's infinite. Isn't there something grounding about being able to capture that chaos in art? Making it exist in a literal, tangible plane, even if it only exists in our mind's eye, is comforting. Art offers a fascinating exploration of the mind and how we can celebrate the subconscious when free of the constraints of reality. It's a human tendency to make sense of a senseless world, and is an even more human thing to try and understand pain through beings and creatures that cause them outside of our control. There is a catharsis in hiding under the sheets from monsters that don't come. It's Burke's understanding that horror is how we are able to take in, process, and cope with the world. It is better to imagine witches flying than to accept pain or strife coming from friends or neighbors. There is nothing more important than catharsis in our minds, where violence and fear have been there since we woke up in dark caves, drawing patterns of beasts waiting to pounce. In the end, monsters are perhaps so scary because they really are just us, staring back in a new way to remind us that we are all capable of horrors, lurking in the shadows of even our finest pieces of art.